have an appropriate gift. And that's why they were traveling with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now that's another reason why they had to have soldiers with them. Because in that day, they could have been robbed and nobody would even find their bodies for years probably. So they had their own entourage, which was the kings with the magi, with the soldiers. All right? Now, it doesn't tell us they rode camels, but if they came out of the Orient, they rode camels. You have to keep in mind, that trail from the Orient down is an ancient trail. Whether you call it the Opium Trail or whichever you want to call it, it started up in Mongolia. And keep in mind, the ruler of Mongolia conquered Rome. Now, he made a journey with his army all the way from Mongolia, all the way down through Asia, all across into Italy, okay, where he defeated Rome. Now, keep that in mind. I mean, that's a historical fact. I'm just quoting you some history here a little bit, because I want you to understand that what we're looking at is something so supernatural. Yes, hallelujah. It's not something that three guys woke up one morning and said, hey, let's do this.
Amen.
That's not what happened. Somebody, whether all three of them, their people saw the star, or one saw the star and called the attention to the other guy and said, did you see that star I saw last night? And it had to be such an unusual star that it drew attention. Yes. Now, when you read the book of Daniel, you're going to rediscover that Nebuchadnezzar several times asked for his people who read the stars. And of course, Daniel would say to them, don't forget the guys in the stars, I'll tell you the answer. And his was a God-given answer, okay? But in this, when you consider the ancient city of Aleppo is making news a lot now, and it's too bad because they've destroyed it. But years ago, when Esther and I had gone there, they had just recently discovered a series of stone tablets that had been written on cuneiform language. And discovered that Abraham went through that city and paid the taxes for 350 adults. Now keep that in mind. How many people traveled with Abraham? Not just Lot. He had lots of lots. He traveled with all of his slaves, all of his people like this, made that journey from the Ur of the Chaldees on in to become the promised land that God gave for his people. Now, the important thing in this is, and I love this, the important thing is they are going to worship a king. Now think about that. They are going not to crown a king. They're going to worship a king. Which means, and when they got there, they fell onto the ground. They fell before, now Jesus was probably 2 or 3 years old by this time. Okay? And they were no longer in the barn with the animals. They were now in a house. Okay? And I can't imagine what Mary must have thought that day when 50 or 60 men with camels arrive at the front door and knock on the door and say, we've come to worship the king. And can't you imagine she had to say, wait a minute, who told you?
Yes.
Right?
Amen.
How would they know? She kept that very much a secret. All right? The only person that knew anything about that was Elizabeth. And maybe Elizabeth told Zechariah. But it was not a big thing, okay? So when these men knock on the door and said, we've come to worship the king. All right? Now, let me back up a little bit. When they got to Jerusalem, and Herod welcomed them in because they were kings, and then Herod discovered the reason they're coming was to worship the king that was born, all right? The person that was born a king of the Jews. Now, Herod not being a Jew, Herod being a man who became extremely rich, approximately 4 miles from Bethlehem, he built a mountain so he could build a palace on top of the mountain. All right? Now, he built a mountain. Now, think about the cost for a few minutes. You're going to build a mountain on top of which you're going to build a castle. That is so great. And the view from there, he could see all the way to Jerusalem. Isn't that wonderful? So Herod builds himself a castle like that, and Jesus is born in a barn.
Yeah.
The real king is born in the barn. The appointed king sits in a palace. But he doesn't live much longer. About 84, he died. Now, that's a little bit questionable as to how, they don't know whether somebody just got rid of him or he really just died. But anyway, the fun of all of this came to me because when I lived in Lebanon, I got exposed to this. One of the classes I took at the university had to do with the Arab mind, how to understand a person from that part of the world, because we Americans don't think like them.
Yes.
We don't do anything like them. We don't eat like them. We don't operate like them. We don't do anything like them. And so I sat in that class and I read this book entitled The Mind of an Arab and tried to figure out, but you know what? It helped me understand Scripture because the Scripture is written through a Middle Eastern mind.
Yes.
It's even when we translate it into English that we try to make it sound American. Well, the British translated it so it sounded like the British. The Germans translated it in that language. But what I'm getting at is that when God begins to do something, now he didn't, the time Jesus was born was not the result of an ad hoc committee. All right? That was planned from before the beginning of the world.
Amen.
All right? That a Savior was going to have to come to this world because God knew that man was not going to do it. And it didn't take long for him to prove that. Adam and Eve in the garden blew it quickly. From then on, there was no other choice but to plan for the Redeemer to come. And so for those years, God's been planning and setting a time for the time when Jesus would come. But he was not going to come as the Son of God. He was going to come as the son of Joseph and Mary.
Hallelujah.
I want you to understand things. There's a lot more about your life that God planned than you think.
Amen.
All right? There are a lot of times when you think you just had a great idea, and in reality, that was something God planted in your mind when you were a baby. Amen. But at just the right time, and with God, everything with God is time perfect. Everything is done right on time. All right? Now, he didn't want to set the time for Adam and Eve. I shouldn't say that. But they sinned in the garden, and from then on, everything changed as far as God's plan for the world was concerned. From that moment on, he planned for a Redeemer. Okay? And but now, let me help you understand something also. Just because you have a knowledge of Middle Eastern history doesn't mean you have a relationship with Jesus.
Amen.
And, I sat in class with a number of students, and I was probably 4 of us that had an experience with Jesus, and the rest of them were just taking the courses they needed to complete for the subjects they wanted a degree in. Typical college.
Yep.
But now, I love this because, God manipulates politicians.
Yes.
He really does.
Yep.
Caesar all of a sudden had an idea to have a census. That was his idea. It was just so happened that census was going to take place when Jesus was going to be born in Bethlehem.
Amen.
When it was the right time for Jesus to be born, Caesar gave the issue for a census to be taken. Now, what I love about this is that God has everything set in order. He's got it all set together. It's all planned. And he knew the time that Jesus was going to be born because he planned that time. You follow me?
Amen.
God is not somebody who just all of a sudden says, "Oh, what a neat idea." That's us. That's not God. And so, when these three kings arrived in Herod's palace and announced to him that they had come to worship the baby, the king that was born. The king that was born. That's why Matthew and Luke, especially Matthew, gives you such a genealogy, so that you know exactly that through Joseph and through Mary you follow it all the way back to King David. That's why they had to be in Bethlehem. That was David's hometown. And they had to get back there for this census so that Jesus could be born in Bethlehem. Because the prophet said so. And if the prophet said so, it had to happen. And it had to happen just like that. And so God has Caesar plan a census. I don't know how long it took to get this kind of word out, scattered throughout the Roman Empire. But he passed this word around, and all of a sudden it reaches Israel, and they have to go to Bethlehem to register. Now, nobody plays around with scripture like I do, I'm sure, but I got to thinking, how much money did those wise men, those kings, have to travel for 2 years?
Okay.
Okay?
Yes.
I'm sure there weren't any Big Macs along the way.
Guaranteed.
And where they found food or how they found food, I don't know. But those men had to travel with a lot of spending money just to make the trip, because they were going to have to go home. You follow?
Amen.
And pardon me, they had to have the appropriate gifts for a king. That's why you have gold, high expensive things like the other items. And I want you to get the understanding that just because they named 3 things doesn't mean there were only 3 single gifts. God knew that Joseph was going to have to leave and go to Egypt and live there for a couple of years until Herod died. And then he was going to have to come back and he couldn't live in Bethlehem. He was going to have to go all the way back to Nazareth because he had to show that his son was called out of Nazareth, a Nazarene. All of this had to happen. So the men bringing these gifts had to bring enough money so that Joseph could take his wife that night when the angel spoke to him and said, "Get out of town." And he packed up his wife and the baby and took off for Egypt. Now they ran that night because they were afraid that if they waited till morning, Herod's soldiers would be in town, and with the baby, they'd not be able to get out of town with that baby. And so he left that night. But there was enough money brought to them, okay, so that they could have a place to live, food, whatever else was needed, for as long as they had to be in Egypt. And then make the journey all the way up to Nazareth, and he started a business up there. Now, all of this, I find it very interesting. And another thought that came to my mind was, Herod must have thought that these kings would have such a loyalty to him as a king that he didn't have to send some of troops or something with them to make sure they came back to him to tell him what they found. Okay?
Yes.
He just said, after you visit them, come on back and see me, boys, and tell me what you found. Well, he didn't realize that God had other plans.
Amen.
And so an angel comes to these kings, these wise men, whatever you want to call them, and says, don't go back to Jerusalem. Go home a different way.
Hallelujah.
Yes.
I mean, isn't it marvelous the way God does things?
Amen.
When you realize that God has the end planned from the beginning.
Hallelujah.
And so all of this was planned and in order so that when the baby was born, it was not something new to the baby because he was in on the planning before he became a human baby.
Amen.